Welcome to my studio. In this video, I want to share with you how to avoid getting blossoms in your paintings. Blossoms are like a white or a light spot that you get with a hard edge around them. If you can see here, you can see these blossoms that are created. This cactus was actually done in our Understanding Watercolor course, and we created blossoms on purpose to get texture. But most of the time, blossoms are created by accident, and they end up someplace that you really don't want them, and they're really a nuisance. So let's try to understand how you get them and how to avoid them. So if you look at these little white areas, what's happened is the surface of the painting is wet, and then you drop more water on it, and it pushes the pigments of the painting outward, and then it creates this hard ring around it. So let's go ahead and do a little painting, and I'll explain to you a little bit about how this works. So if I were to put some color on my paper, I'm going to let that sit. And if I am painting and I have more water on my paintbrush than I do on my paper, I'm going to create a blossom. So as the paper, you start painting, the paper is drying as you're painting, and then you go back in with a really wet paint or water on your paintbrush, then these blossoms are started. So you can see my painting is starting to dry a little bit, the sheen is starting to change, but the paper is still wet. So we're going to give that just a minute, and we are going to see if we can get a blossom out of it. So if I'm going to, maybe I'm going to add a yellow color, and I want to paint maybe in this purple area. My paper is still wet, and my paintbrush is quite wet. If I touch the paper that's still wet with more water on my paintbrush than on the paper, it'll create this blossom effect. Can you see how that just flared out like a firework? And what happens is as it dries, the outside edge of that blossom gets darker and darker, and the inside stays light. So you get these bursts of white flares, which are really cool if you're looking for them, and they'll help you in your painting. But if you don't want them, they look like a mistake, and they actually they're very frustrating. So the whole idea of how to keep from getting a blossom is always think about how much water you have on your paper and on your paintbrush. So as I'm teaching my students, I often will say to them things like, okay, when you're painting this background and you're starting to add other colors, make sure you don't have more water on your brush than you have on your paper. And so they can avoid from getting these blossoms. Let's go ahead and do a couple more here. I'm going to take some yellow, and the blossoms show up a lot more on the darker values, but we're going to just take a couple different colors and just do a couple more samples. So oftentimes you get blossoms when you're touching up to a color you've already put on your paper, and you're going to add a color right next to it and let it blend together. But the paper is starting to dry of the first color you put down, and then you want to put that second color down, and there's more water on your paintbrush, and it will create that blossom going into that first color that you put down. So as you see the sheen of this green change, you can see that it's starting to dry. So we're going to give it just a second to dry, and we'll come back to that and add more water on our paintbrush than what is on our paper. Let's go back to the yellow one for 1 minute. That one's drying a little bit more. I'm going to grab a darker color, and we're just going to see if we can create a blossom. It's really interesting that oftentimes when you want to create a blossom, it's hard to get. But when you don't want to create them, they're really quite easy to get. But I'm going to make sure I have a lot of water on my paintbrush, and I'm just going to put a dot here. And you can see how that's starting to flare out. And a nice soft edge is wonderful, but if it flares out to the point that the edge gets hard, then that is a blossom. So as that's drying, we'll see what happens there. And I'm going to grab another color, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with a nice wet color, and I'm going to touch up right up to this green. And if I'm working with a nice wet color and this is partially dry, what's going to happen is it's going to create that same effect along the edge here. So we'll see if we got if we've got enough water there, that happens. Oftentimes with a watercolor blossom, you actually don't even see that it's happening until after it dries, and then you see. But remember, watercolor blossoms can be avoided, and if you get one, you can actually soften it out. So if I wanted to soften out a watercolor blossom, say I wanted to soften this out, this is getting a darker ring, and as it dries it will get darker and darker. I can actually just go over the whole thing with water or a light layer of paint and soften that out. But if I stopped at a certain spot instead of doing the entire shape, then I would get another blossom or a hard edge because of where I stopped. So this area, you can see that this is starting to get that harder edge on it. If I wanted to cover that up and I wanted to see if I could fix that, I could take some more paint and I could actually go over it and I could fix that. But if you see, if I stopped right there, I would have a hard edge that I couldn't hide. But if I cover the entire shape, then I wouldn't have a hard edge. So the idea, and you can rub it back and forth. I like to use my brush and kind of soften it out if I need to. I can rub it back and forth to get that softness out of there. So it doesn't really matter what the color is that you're working on. If you're able to layer it with another layer and do a little rubbing to rub it out, you can fix it off in that way as well. So you can see this is starting to get kind of a blossom in there. A nice soft blend is great, but when we get the water, too much water, and we get that lighter value with a harder edge, then you don't want that. So just remember, if you get them, that you can get rid of them, just go ahead and add another layer. Or one of the best ways I know how to do is let it dry all the way and then paint it again over the top. And where the hard edge is, you can just rub back and forth with your brush to soften that out and then just repaint over the top. So sometimes people will say that watercolor is so unforgiving, but sometimes you just have to sit on your hands and not do anything with it for a few minutes, let it dry, and then paint over the top of it and rub out those hard edges that you get. I hope you enjoyed this video. Learning how to get blossoms when you want, how to avoid them when you don't want, will help you in improving all your paintings. And if you like this video, please subscribe below. And if you have any ideas or suggestions of things that you want to learn, please let me know. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.